Hey out there, YouTubers. It's only a few more days until Halloween, just 2 more days. So I decided to go ahead and post another creepy story out here for you. This one comes from South Alabama. I've heard it several times in my life. I don't know if it's true, but it really is creepy, and I hope you enjoy it. It's called The Baby. Back in the 1930s during World War I, there was a young woman named Elizabeth who lived in South Alabama. Her husband had to go off to war, and he was fighting overseas. Elizabeth was pregnant with their child. Unfortunately, she had to give birth to the child while her husband was away. Several months later, after the child was born, she received a letter notifying her that her husband had been killed during action in the war. Saddened by this news and scared of having to raise a baby on her own, Elizabeth did the only thing she knew to do at the time. She decided to take the baby somewhere where a loving couple could raise it for her. She walked down the path a long ways and found a farmhouse that she knew about where a nice older couple lived. She decided to leave the baby in a basket there, swallowed up in cloth to keep it warm, with a note pinned on it. She did this and knocked on the door and hurried away into the darkness. What she didn't know was that the older couple was away, traveling, and wouldn't be back for a few days. When the couple returned, they found the basket. They found the cloth. They found it ripped to pieces and bloodstained. A pack of wolves passing through had had their meal. The poor little baby was gone. Elizabeth never knew because she left the area after she dropped off the baby. But some say years later she did find out and died of a broken heart. Elizabeth was buried in a cemetery in South Alabama, out-of-the-way cemetery hidden in the woods called Hargrove Cemetery. For years, people claimed they could see the spirit of a weeping woman running through the cemetery looking for her baby. They knew it was Elizabeth, and sometimes they would hear the cry of an infant. Many people would go out to the cemetery to see if they could catch a glimpse of the ghost. Well, a few people anyway. Most were too afraid to go out there at night. But during the 1950s, the late 1950s, a couple named Betsy and Russell, a teenage couple at the local high school, decided they would go out there and park and see if they could catch sight of the ghost. Now, Betsy wasn't too happy about this. She wasn't too thrilled. But her boyfriend Russell talked her into it, and they decided to go out there. He bought her a meal first to kind of ease things over, and then they went out there later in the evening and parked in the cemetery. Russell left the headlights on, and he left the engine running and the radio playing. He decided this would be the opportune time to make a move. So he and Betsy began kissing and making out, in such a way that they steamed up the windows around the car. After a while, Betsy glanced out the window, and through the steam, she could see a little ways out there in the headlights, and she could swear on her days that she saw the figure of a woman suddenly run by the headlights, a woman with her face buried in her hands as if she were crying. Betsy pushed Russell off and said, Look, there's a woman out there, I saw her." Russell thought that Betsy was trying to make something up to give him the brush off, keep him away, and keep some distance there. So he said, "Oh, come on, Betsy." But she insisted, "Russell, there's a woman out there. She ran past the headlights. I saw her. She looked like she was upset. Maybe she needs help." Russell was kind of reluctant to get out of the car and go looking, but he decided to ease Betsy's anxiety, stepped out of the car, made sure to tell Betsy to lock it behind him so no one could get in, and he walked off into the darkness looking for this woman who Betsy had seen. Betsy stayed behind in the car listening to the radio and waiting. She waited for what seemed like a long time, and Russell didn't come back. Well, she decided maybe she should drive through the cemetery a little bit and look for him. So she moved over to the driver's side, and she took it out of gear. She started to roll forward, and before she could accelerate, something darted toward the car, and it looked like it disappeared underneath the front end. Betsy felt a bump, and she immediately stopped the car and put it back into park. What was that? She stopped and she listened. Did I hit something? An animal? Tap screen, tap screen, tap screen. Something came from behind Betsy. It sounded like something dragging across the trunk of the car behind her. Tap screen, tap screen, tap screen. Betsy froze in her seat. Tap screen. It sounded as if it slid up the back window. And then it started across the roof of the car. Tap screen, tap screen, tap screen, tap screen. Something slid along the roof of the car toward the front. Betsy remained frozen. It felt like ice crawling down her skin. The chills went in a wave across her back as she listened. Tap screen, tap screen, tap screen. Whatever it was made it to the front, and before it could slide down the windshield, Betsy closed her eyes, and she prayed, "Oh, dear Lord, please don't let this be anything bad. Please just let it be some animal or something. Please." She heard, "Oh," and something slid down the windshield. She opened her eyes and looked. There before her, lying on the windshield, peering in with a hand pressed up, was the small form of a tattered, bloody baby looking in. There were just tears across its face where it had been chewed away, and blood caked all over it. The blanket wrapped around it was tattered and pulled halfway away. All sorts of claw marks and bites and tears all around its body. It peered in at her, and it opened its mouth, and it let out the loudest, most piercing wail that she'd ever heard. Ah! Betsy screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed into the night. The next morning, the police, having received a report of 2 missing teenagers, drove by the cemetery and spotted the car, Russell's car, sitting out there. They drove out to it, and what they found was not a pretty sight. Russell was found underneath the front of the car. What Betsy had felt when she went forward, the bump, was actually Russell. He was running back to the car in a hurry, slid in the muddy ground, and fell under the front of the car. It rolled over him and crushed him to death. Betsy never knew. Inside the car, they found Betsy, curled up, just like a little child, curled in the floorboard of the front seat, whimpering, shaking. She had screamed so much in the night that her voice had gone hoarse. All she could do was whisper as they tried to pull her from the car. No, get it away on the windshield, get it away. The police officer looked on the windshield. What he found was what looked like bloody claw marks, and underneath the windshield wiper, pinned there, was a piece of blue, tattered, bloody blanket. I hope you enjoyed this, and happy Halloween.